Hello everyone, I am Demented Kirby, and welcome to my channel, the Commander Tavern. The Commander Tavern is a channel dedicated to my favorite Magic the Gathering format. A Flight is a new series I'm experimenting with where I review the latest released or upcoming set for any and all cards that might have some form of impact in Commander. These episodes will be done under the assumption that you've already seen all of the cards in the set and isn't meant to be a spoiler video. This video is my own analysis on the cards I feel are most useful in the Commander format. If you like this idea and would like for me to continue with the series, let me know in the likes and comments. A Flight is a sampling of several brews, so in this pilot episode I will be sampling all cards from the completely spoiled Throne of Eldraine. If you want to jump to any particular section of this review, you can find the timestamps down in the description, as well as any deck text for any commanders I've brewed with that are mentioned throughout this video. Throne of Eldraine is a top-down design set inspired by the romantic Arthurian legend of Camelot on one hand and Grimm's fairy tales on the other. The 82nd Magic expansion, it is a large set with 300 cards, so this will be quite the sampling. Since the focus is on cards useful for Commander, let's begin with the legendary creatures in the set. There are two mono-white potential commanders, Linden the Steadfast Queen and Sir Alan the Lion's Claw. Linden the Steadfast Queen is a 3/3 human noble with vigilance that costs triple white. This casting cost is something that I am going to dive into a little deeper later in the video. Linden also has a triggered ability where she gains you 1 life wherever a creature you control attacks, as long as the creature is white. Although Linden passes the vanilla test while also having 2 decent abilities, I don't really see her as starting the game in the command zone. Even if you weaponize life gain, there are just so many better ways to do so than by running Linden. I could maybe see her in the 99 in a deck that cares about swinging with a bunch of white weenies or tokens, but even so, I don't really see the potential in a format where players usually start the game at 40 life. Sir Alan is also a creature I don't see being all that useful in the command zone. Sir Alan is a 4/4 human knight with first strike for 3 generic and 2 white. This already makes it pretty difficult to cast in a mono-white deck. His triggered ability, where he gives other creatures you control +1/+1 whenever he attacks, is incredibly lackluster. For the exact same casting cost, you could include Dictate of Heliod instead. Not only does it have flash, so you can cast it in response to blockers, at the end of the turn before yours, etc., but it also gives all of your creatures +2/+2 with no strings attached. And sure, unlike Dictate of Heliod, Sir Alan can be in your command zone and isn't the worst commander for that casting cost. He's definitely better than Hasdur the Abbot and Rashka the Slayer. But for his casting cost, I'd rather have God Eternal Oketra in my command zone. Mono Blue was graced with 3 legendary creatures, Emery, Lurker of the Loch, Gadwick the Wizened, and Sir Eleonora the Discerning. The most lackluster of these is clearly Sir Eleonora. She is a star 4 human knight for 3 generic and 2 blue, whose power is equal to the number of cards in your hand. She also cantrips when entering the battlefield. She has a static ability that taxes opponents for 2 whenever they target her with a spell. Honestly, I feel like she's just a mishmash of abilities stapled onto a very bad legendary creature. She's not the worst commander in the set because that honor goes to Sir Alan. That being said, I rank her above Sir Alan for the simple fact that she draws you a card when she enters the battlefield, and because her power, being the same as the amount of cards in my hand, could potentially make her kill an opponent in 1 shot if I'm drawing a bunch of cards, or if I draw enough cards at instant speed to give her 21 power in response to the damage step. But other than that, I don't really see her being a legendary creature to build around. She might have some use in the 99 as a win out of nowhere card in decks where you're drawing a ton of cards. But even then, she has no evasion and no haste, so it's just too many hoops to jump through to be worth it. Gadwick is a 3/3 human wizard for X and triple blue that draws you X cards when it enters the battlefield. So, as many others have pointed out, it's a Blue Sun's Zenith on a body. He also has a second ability which seems more like an afterthought in design than anything else. Whenever you cast a blue spell, tap target non-land permanent an opponent controls. Having a sorcery speed Blue Sun Zenith in the command zone isn't a bad thing, and it's pretty interesting. However, if you really want to be drawing into a bunch of cards in mono blue, Azami Lady of Scrolls is such a better commander for that. A wizard tribal deck with Azami at the helm draws a ton of cards. Well, what about his second ability? I think it's more cute than anything. That being said, I don't think Gadwick is such a bad commander. Out of the 3 mono blue commanders, I'm leaning more towards Emery being the clear better of them. The Lady of the Lake is a 1/2 merfolk wizard for 2 generic and 1 blue. She costs 1 less for each artifact you control, which means that she could potentially be cast on turn 1 quite consistently. On top of that, she has 2 more abilities that synergize with the first one. When she enters the battlefield, she self-mills you for 4, but you can tap her in order to cast an artifact from your graveyard. This can fuel an infinite combo with Mirren Spy and Lotus Petal. You sacrifice Lotus Petal for mana. Then you tap Emery in order to cast it from your graveyard. Casting Lotus Petal triggers Mirren Spy, which untaps Emery. Rinse and repeat. Unfortunately, Urza Lord High Artificer has become the benchmark for mono blue commanders and infinite mana. Urza has a built-in mana sink that wins you the game with infinite mana, but Emery would need another card to take advantage of the infinite mana. However, I still think Emery is in the same echelon as Urza, or at the very least, on his coattails. With Aetherflux Reservoir, Emery can kill off the entire table with all the life you gain from casting Lotus Petal infinitely many times. You can also use the infinite mana to power any other I Win combo that uses infinite mana. At the very least, Emery is a potential infinity engine in the command zone, and I fully expect to see her be abused by the CEDH community. Mono Black is definitely the legendary creatures who received the most TLC in ELD. Ayara, First of Locthwain, Rankle, Master of Pranks, and Sir Conrad the Grim are definitely the most inspiring out of all the mono-colored legends, at least in my opinion. Ayara is a 2/3 elf noble for triple black that has, whenever she or another black creature enters the battlefield under your control, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. Additionally, you can tap her and sacrifice another black creature to draw a card. Whereas I see parallels between Emery and Urza, I see parallels between Ayara and Yawgmoth Thran Physician. Ayara just has so many different ways to build around, and she is a win con in the command zone if you manage to generate infinite enter the battlefield triggers with black creatures. If you want to guarantee that your creatures are black, you can simply run Painter's Servant and or Darkest Hour. If you want an even more in-depth and detailed analysis on Ayara, you can find a complete 100 card deck tech video in the link above where I present my take on Ayara. Similarly to Ayara, Sir Conrad is a win con in the command zone. Sir Conrad is a 5/4 human knight for 3 generic and 2 black that deals 1 damage to each opponent for every creature that's discarded, milled, or killed. If you have infinite death triggers, then you can potentially win the game right then and there. Sir Conrad also goes amazingly well as a 1 in the 99 in an Aristocrats deck, a mill deck, a discard deck, or even a stacks deck. If that weren't enough, for 1 and a black, he mills each player for 1. So, with infinite mana and Ulamog the Infinite Gyre or Kozilek Butcher of Truth in your library, you can basically mill the entire table. He's definitely one of the best legendary creatures in the set. With Sir Conrad being a bit pricey at 5 mana, even though black can produce mana fairly easily, I would try and build a deck that wins the moment Sir Conrad enters the battlefield. Keeping him around long enough to get dealt with without winning will set you back quite a bit. So I feel that the best way to build Sir Conrad is to first get your engine in place and then cast him before going off. And that infinite engine should definitely be infinite death triggers. Mike Trike combo works really well here, as well as any other similar infinite combo like Gravecrawler and Phyrexian Altar. Rankle is a 3/3 fairy rogue with flying and haste for 2 generic and 2 black. Rankle has a triggered ability where whenever he deals combat damage to a player, you can choose any of his modes in any combination. The best of which is essentially having everyone discard a card and sacrifice a creature. Rankle might seem like the weakest out of these mono-black commanders, but he is by no means weak in a vacuum. It's relatively consistent to cast him before turn 4, and he's a hasty 3/3 with evasion, so at the very least he can get some damage in early game. That being said, I don't feel Rankle is sufficiently impactful to consider him as the commander of a mono-black deck. Even if the theme were discard, I would choose Gwendolyn de Courcy over Rankle. For the same converted mana cost, Gwendolyn grants me access to 2 more colors and doesn't need to connect to an opponent for that person to discard a card. Additionally, the card she makes said player discard can't be chosen by that player, it has to be at random. As for the stacks theme, I'd rather run Shattergang Brothers for the same converted mana cost. They might require mana to be paid for their stacks ability, but at least they don't need to connect with combat damage, so it can be done whenever you can pay for the ability and at instant speed. Similarly to Mono White, Mono Red only got 2 new additions to the Command Zone card pool, Serkara the Bold and Torban Thane of Redfell. Serkara is a 3/3 human knight that costs 3 generic and 2 red. She has a triggered ability where whenever an instant or sorcery spell you control deals damage to a player, you exile the top card of your library. You can play that card that turn. She also has a tap to ping for 1 ability. Her first ability essentially makes your burn spells have a pseudo cantrip attached to them. This means that if you shock someone, you exile the top card of your library and are able to cast it during that same turn. Not only does this provide temporary card advantage, but you can also abuse this with burn spells that hit multiple players. Cards like Flame Rift will exile 1 card for each opponent in the game, allowing you to have a mini hand you can play from exile that turn. It might not seem like much, but not many mono red commanders can boast any kind of card advantage. That being said, she definitely fits as one in the 99 in any deck devoted to burning or pinning, since she can tap to deal 1 damage to any target, as well as give that pseudo cantrip clause to your burn spells. The other potential mono red commander is Torban, a 2/4 dwarf noble that costs 1 generic and 3 red. His ability is one that has already caused a great stir in the Magic community. He basically increases all red damage you dish out to opponents by 2. That lightning bolt that isn't that impactful in Commander is now a 5 damage instant speed burn spell for just 1 red mana. Enchantments that burn are also more brutal with Torban, so cards like Pyrohemia and Sulfuric Vortex are crazy with Torban. All those red creatures that tap for 1 damage now tap for 3 damage. All those Chandra Planeswalkers that ping now ping for 2 more. All those burn spells deal 2 more damage. All those 1/1 hasty weenies Red is notorious for creating are now essentially 3/1s. This means Torban can be the commander of decks ranging from Token Swarm to Burn to Tim Tribal to even Chandra Tribal. Torban is definitely a commander that can be used for aggressive damage as well as janky damage. I definitely had a bunch of ideas on how to brew around him when he was first revealed. Just for the lols, I'd build a mono red Super Friends deck where they all burn opponents for 2 more damage, a bunch of pingers, and weenie token generators. Mono green has Questing Beast, Surfarin the Henchhammer, and Yorvo, Lord of Garenbrig. No surprise, Questing Beast is a 4/4 beast with Vigilance, Death Touch, and Haste for just 2 generic and 2 green. For that alone, I love this creature as a very aggro legend in the command zone. Notwithstanding, it also has 3 more abilities. It can be chump blocked by creatures with power 2 or less. Combat damage from your creatures can be prevented, and when it deals combat damage to a player, it also deals that much damage to a target planeswalker that player controls. That means that you don't have to choose between attacking a player or their planeswalker. You can do both. There's so many ways to build around Questing Beast as a commander. Since it already has 3 keywords and a form of built-in evasion, you can go Voltron. Being able to beef it up can make it quite a threat on the board. You can also go wide with creatures and use fog effects to protect them, but not your opponent's creatures, since their attack damage will be prevented, but not your creatures. Overall, this creature can lead to some very inspiring and spicy brews. Surfarin is a 2/2 human knight for double green that has, whenever this creature attacks, another target attacking creature gets +X until end of turn, where X is his power. At first glance, this uncommon legendary creature might seem bland and unassuming, but he is incredibly cheap. You can build around Surfarin similarly to Isamaru Hound of Conduct. In a format where players are more focused on big and splashy plays, you can get Surfarin into play on turn 2, but you can also get him into play turn 1 with cards like Lotus Petal, Elvish Spirit Guide, Gemstone Caverns, and other similar cards. Pumping Surfarin with auras and equipment can allow for quite the beater early on in the game. You can also recast him multiple times a game with relative ease. His ability means that whenever he attacks, you're pumping another attacking creature with whatever's pumping him. So you could go a semi-Voltron route with Surfarin. If you're playing Two-Headed Giant or other variants where multiple players share a turn, you can also use Surfarin to bump another player's attacker. In short, I see Sir Farron as a way cheaper and mono-green Xenagos God of Rebels that doesn't give haste. Yorvo is another interesting mono-green commander from the set. The set seems to have made mono-green legends into epic beaters, and that's not really that much of a bad thing. Yorvo is a 0/0 giant noble for triple green that enters the battlefield with 4+1/+1 counters on it. Similar to Linden's casting cost, I'll discuss it in greater detail later on. Not only is Yorvo a 4/4 for 3 mana, but it gets a +1/+1 counter whenever another green creature enters the battlefield under your control. If that creature happens to be more powerful than Yorvo, he gets an additional +1/+1 counter. In mono green, that's just crazy. His ability doesn't have a non-token creature clause. That means that any spell or ability that creates a ton of green creature tokens will also pump Yorvo for that same amount of +1/+1 counters. On top of that, any effect or ability that increases or even doubles +1/+1 counters will make Yorvo incredibly huge. Although he doesn't have any built-in evasion, that's not that difficult to grant with equipment that exists in abundance. Thus, Yorvo can be a Voltron commander that can eliminate a player literally out of nowhere. Since Yorvo is pumped by green creatures entering your battlefield, your Voltron deck won't suffer as others do because you'll have other creatures in play besides Yorvo. So you'll have your chump blockers, sacrifice fodder, etc. And the best green creatures for this kind of deck are mana dorks anyways. So you get mana acceleration as well as pump for your win con after it enters the battlefield. Yorvo also goes great as one of the 99 in a deck dedicated to +1/+1 counters. As for the multicolor identity legendary creatures in the set, I've already covered all of them in a deck tech which you can find in the playlist in the link above. I have an in-depth deck tech on Alila Artful Provocateur, Corvold Faker's King, Sir Gwyn, Hero of Ashvale, Grumgully the Generous, and Chulainn Teller of Tales, which was the first video I made for this channel. Just like with Ayara, First of Locthwain, each of those legendary creatures have a 100 card deck tech video where I discuss my deck in great detail, how I build the deck, why I chose some cards, and how to pilot it. The other multicolor identity legendary creature from Throne of Eldraine that I haven't made a deck tech on is Kenrith the Return King. Kenrith is a 5/5 human noble for 4 generic and 1 white with 5 abilities, each requiring a different color to activate. In this sense, Kenrith is easier to cast than legendary creatures with all 5 colors in its casting cost, but has all color identities similar to Sisay with a Light Captain and General Tazrin. Kenrith is basically a mana sink for infinite mana. He has 5 different options, but not all of them provide a win con. With infinite mana, you can sink it into his second ability to make an unblocked creature or creatures infinitely large and win that way. Or you can sink it into his third ability and gain infinite life and weaponize it with Aetherflux Reservoir. Or you can sink it into his fourth ability to draw your entire deck and win with Laboratory Maniac or Jace Wielder of Mysteries in play. His first and last abilities are still useful and relevant depending the case, but with infinite mana they won't necessarily win you the game. I see Kenrith as another way to sink infinite mana to get the win, like Golos Tireless Pilgrim for example. For the same casting cost between Kenrith and Golos, I would go with Golos. Golos can ramp for any land when it enters the battlefield. With infinite mana, you can cast your entire deck and win on the spot. There aren't as many conditions for that win as with Kenrith. Alright, now let's break down the cards by colors, starting with white. Acclaimed Contender is a circumstantial card acceleration since it can only pick a card that has specific qualities. That being said, it's still card advantage on a white creature. All That Glitters is a great aura in an Artifacts and or Enchantments Matters deck. If you're running ways to generate lots of treasures and clues and food or mirrors, thopters, etc., you can definitely make a creature huge. Archon of Absolution goes great in Pillow Fort along the lines of Windborn Muse, Baird, Steward of Argive, etc. Ardenvale Tactician is useful as an adventure to stop up to 2 potentially nasty attackers or to tap down 2 potential blockers. It can then be cast from its adventure as a 2/3 flyer for 3 mana, which are solid stats, especially on a common card. Bartered Cow. I'm just mentioning this card out of the utmost disappointment I feel over it not having the cow creature type. Noble was eliminated and then reaccepted as a creature type, but cows were already a creature type, so why not have a cow be a cow? the world may never know. Charming Prince is a 2/2 for 2 that has 3 enter the battlefield triggers. Definitely abusable in decks like Rune of the Hidden Realm, Chulainn Teller of Tales, Brago King Eternal, Carador Ghost Chieftain, and other flickering, bouncing recursion commanders that like to get value out of creatures with enter the battlefield abilities. The Circle of Loyalty is a legendary artifact that, although only really useful in a Knight Tribal deck, Throne of Eldraine does provide a lot of Knight Tribal support, so it can definitely find a home in such a deck. Deafening Silence has an effect similar to Rule of Law, Arcane Laboratory, etc., except it's way cheaper at the trade-off of only affecting non-creature spells. Fairy Guide Mother is a pretty good in evasive Winnie decks since it has the benefit of also pumping a creature for just 2 mana for its adventure, and then being cast from its adventure for just 1 white mana. Giant Killer is able to destroy a big creature at instant speed, which is very relevant in a format where the creatures that happen to be swinging one's way tend to be huge. On top of that, you can also cast it from its adventure. Then it's a decoy when on the battlefield, tapping down a potential attacker or blocker, which is definitely an underrated ability in Commander. Happily Ever After is an enchantment that provides a win con in an I win situation. However, with Coalition Victory banned in Commander, I wouldn't be surprised if this card sees the ban hammer immediately after release. It's way easier to get a victory off of this thing than Coalition Victory, and you can even pull it off in mono white, with cards like Scrap Basket. Don't get your hopes up brewing around this one. Harmonious Archon is a card that's crazy in Commander. It's a 4/5 with flying for 4 generic and 2 white that enters the battlefield with essentially 2 3/3s. And why are they 3/3s? Because this creature makes all non-Archon creatures have base power and toughness 3/3. In a white weenie deck, this can make your creatures pretty dangerous. This also makes your opponent's creatures 3/3, but you can always use it depending on the situation. For some really spicy tech, add Conspiracy, Arcane Adaptation, or Xenograph to make all your creatures Archon, so their power and toughness aren't affected by it. Hushbringer. Although this dies to just about everything except a Saproling sneezing, it still shuts down a ton of strategies that are common in EDH, especially enter the battlefield triggers and death triggers. A hate bearer through and through, it's a 1/2 for 2 mana that will really attract the hate. Outflank is a great budget removal card in a Creatures Matters deck. For just 1 white mana, you could potentially kill a huge threat on the board with minimal effort. No one expects a Path to Exile in a budget game, but Outflank can do the job about almost as well as Path to Exile. Rally for the Throne creates 2 chump blockers at instant speed, but if you only paid white mana, you can gain 1 life for each creature you control. This is definitely a great spell to have in the late game when you find yourself on the rope. It's also going to be really cheap, so it's great for those budget decks. Realm Cloaked Giant is a card that is definitely going in my Zurgo Helm Smasher deck. You essentially wipe the board of creatures and then you can cast it next turn to have a huge beater in play with a relatively empty board. This won't get rid of giants or changelings, but at least it'll get rid of most creatures in a multiplayer Commander deck for just 1 more mana than Wrath of God. You can then cast it from exile as a 7/7 with Vigilance for 7 mana. That's nothing to scoff at. Righteousness basically kills any attacker for just 1 white mana. It's definitely useful in a budget build, so it can definitely take care of most threats coming your way. Blocking with Birds of Paradise and then in response to damage, tap it to cast this spell, targeting it would be quite hilarious. Trapped in the Tower is a circumstantial pacifism. It has the bonus of making a creature unable to activate its activated abilities as a trade-off to not being able to enchant flying creatures. True Love's Kiss is another budget card that's worth considering. It's a strictly better Altar's Light since it's also a cantrip. This card is great at getting rid of the 15 Theros block gods, which is probably why it's in this set, as well as all the creatures with 4 hybrid mana symbols in their casting cost. Is Devotion going to be an obvious mechanic in the next set, which is Return to Theros? No doubt. Worthy Knight is amazing in a Knight tribal deck, or a Changeling tribal deck. This card can generate a bunch of creatures in the right deck since it essentially gives you 2 creatures for the price of 1. Mace of the Valiant is an amazing artifact since it gets a charge counter every time a creature enters the battlefield under your control. Notice that it doesn't say non-token creature, meaning that you can easily abuse this with generating a ton of tokens at once. It then gives equipped creature +1/+1 for each charge counter on it, as well as giving that creature vigilance. It costs 3 to cast and 3 to equip, but it's a good card that can do a lot of damage if not dealt with. Silverwing Squadron is a star human knight for 5 generic and 1 white with flying and vigilance. That might seem a bit overcosted for something that doesn't impact the game the moment it enters the battlefield. However, its power and toughness are each equal to the number of creatures you control. Then, when it attacks, it creates a number of 2/2 knight creature tokens for each opponent you have. So it essentially pumps itself every time it attacks. It's definitely a great card that could be slotted in the higher parts of the mana curve of many decks. As for blue, we have Folio of Fancies, which is a very interesting artifact in various types of decks. It's cheap to cast with a relatively cheap activated ability. Since this artifact has everyone drawing a bunch of cards and opponents potentially milling a lot of cards, I see this card going in wheeling decks like the Locust God, Nekusar the Mind Razor, Kaidel and Vial Smasher, Phoenix God of Deception, etc. Definitely an interesting card, no doubt. Frogify is similar to auras like Darksteel Mutation and Foul Play, as well as spells like Snake Form. I feel it's weaker than auras like Song of the Dryads and Imprison in the Moon, since those are amazing ways to almost permanently get rid of commanders. However, it's still a good way to deal with indestructible creatures or other aggravating creatures like hate bears, utility creatures, etc. The only downside is that when the controller uses it to attack, it'll easily die and then be recurable or reanimatable. But it's still a useful way to get rid of creatures in mono blue. Hypnotic Sprite is a good creature for heavy control decks since it's a situational counterspell that can later be recast from exile as a 2/1 flyer for double blue, which isn't bad. That way you get your counterspell and a blocker in the same card. Into the Story is a good late game draw spell at instant speed. It's not super amazing, but you could potentially draw 4 cards at instant speed at the end of the turn before yours for just 4 mana. The Magic Mirror is a legendary artifact that's easy to cast in a spell-slinging deck. Then it draws you more cards the more turns it stays on the battlefield. You could even accelerate the process with Proliferate. In a spell-slinging deck, Flux Channeler pairs extremely well with it, since it'll proliferate its knowledge counters with every non-creature spell you cast. Merfolk Secret Keeper is a 0/4 merfolk creature that you can cast from an adventure for just 1 blue. You can pay 1 blue in order to send it on an adventure, and doing so mills the top 4 cards of any player's library. I see this as being incredibly useful in a Phoenix God of Deception deck, since it can mill 4, which on its own is crumbs in a 100 card singleton format. But in a dedicated deck of mill, 4 cards adds up with the rest of the milling. You can then recast it as a creature for just 1 blue. A 4 toughness creature that mills for 4 when tapping with Phoenix in play. So it's definitely going in my own Phoenix deck for sure. Midnight Clock is a very convoluted way of getting a one-sided Time Twister effect, but at least it taps for blue with a converted mana cost of 3. You can also make it go faster by essentially paying its mana cost or proliferating. Mirror Maid is a clone for enchantments and artifacts. I love clones and similar effects in EDH since you're restricted to your commander's color identity when deck building. But at least if any of your opponents brings a gun to the knife fight, Mirror Maid can become the same kind of gun, and for potentially cheaper since it only costs 1 generic and 2 blue to cast. Overwhelmed Apprentice. For me, this is a strictly better Omen Speaker since it mills each opponent for 2 while still giving you Scry 2 and costing 1 generic less. It also has a body of 1/2 for 1 mana, which surpasses the vanilla test. Being uncommon also makes it relatively easy to acquire on a budget. This card goes great in decks that bounce, blink, reanimate creatures like Brago, Chulane, Rune, etc. in order to maximize its value. Run Away Together is a great way to bounce 2 creatures in a multiplayer game. It might have to be from 2 different players, but you could use it to bounce back one of your blockers after blocking an unblocked attacker from that player. Or just use it to bounce a creature from 2 opponents. Sage of the Falls is a 2/5 Merfolk wizard for 4 generic and 1 blue, so it's a bit overcosted. That being said, it could find a home in a Merfolk tribal deck since it loots every time a non-human creature enters the battlefield under your control. Stolen by the Fae costs X and 2 blue to return a creature with that X converted mana cost to its controller's hand. It might seem like a steep price to pay, but you do get X 1/1 blue flyers for your effort. That being said, it's not for every deck, but decks that can produce a ton of mana will have no problems casting this to not just bounce any huge creature, but getting a ton of fairies too. Turn into a Pumpkin is an instant speed non-land permanent bounce. This is great for getting rid of cards that blue can't really deal with, such as enchantments. As a bonus, if you cast it with 3 blue mana, you get a food. That's not a pressing bonus to have stapled onto the card, but at least it slightly compensates for the casting cost. Yet, if food or artifacts matter in your deck, then the bonus is most likely welcome. Fairy Formation is a 5/4 flyer for 4 generic and 1 blue that isn't that overcosted in Commander, so it's not out of place in a deck. It also has an ability that can create a 1/1 flyer and draw you a card for 3 generic and 1 blue. Some artifacts draw you a card for 4 mana, and that's it. But at least you get a blocker and a beater that makes this card better. Shimmer Dragon is an amazing card for a great many decks. It's a 5/6 flyer for 4 generic and 2 blue with conditional hexproof. But since it's going in an Artifact Matters deck, it's bound to get that hexproof by the time you get it in play. Additionally, it allows you to draw a card at instant speed just by tapping 2 untapped artifacts. Oh, and did I already mention that it's a 5/6 flyer with hexproof, making it a great blocker and beater? Definitely an auto include in artifact heavy decks. Alright, onto the black cards. Bell of the Brawl. First off, love the name. It's a play on Bell of the Ball, and I love that. Card-wise, it's a 3/2 for 3 with some form of evasion and menace. In a dedicated Knight tribal deck, it pumps other knights you control +1/+0 when it attacks, so it's a battle cry type effect as well. Blacklance Paragon is a 3/1 for just 2 mana, so that's not bad. It also has Flash, which makes it even better since it has an Enter the Battlefield ability. When this creature enters the battlefield, it gives target knight Death Touch and lifelink until end of turn. So it's essentially a 2-costed instant that makes a knight a rattlesnake while also gaining you life. Fortunately, it stays on the battlefield as a 3/1 afterwards. In a deck pumping knights and or creatures, it'll definitely be a solid body on the battlefield too. The Cauldron of Eternity is Black's legendary artifact from the set. It's incredibly easy to cast in Graveyard Matters decks since its cost is reduced by 2 generic for each creature card in your graveyard. Additionally, when your creatures die, they're bottom deck. What's crazy about this card is its quote-unquote downside, because its next ability allows you to reanimate any creature from your graveyard for just 2 generic and 1 black. The downside being that any creature that dies is bottom decked, so you are limited to what you can reanimate. But the true downside of this card is that its activated ability can only be done at sorcery speed. I don't see its second ability being its downside. I know Grenzo Dungeon Warden sure doesn't see it as a downside. CDC Brood Tyrant certainly doesn't mind the downside either, especially when she's self-milling and reanimating throughout the whole game anyways. Clackbridge Troll is an 8/8 with trample and haste for just 5 mana with a cute downside. When it enters the battlefield, target opponent gets 3/0/1 white goat tokens. Also, any opponent may sacrifice a creature in order to tap it. But if they do, you gain 3 life and draw a card. This makes it leagues better than cards with similar effects like Desecrated Demon. This card goes great in decks that give creatures to opponents for value, like my Griswold the Dreadsower deck, which you can find a budget deck tech video on it in the link above. Or in stacks decks where players losing, sacrificing creatures triggers other things. Even if not, it's an 8/8 Trampler, which is a threat on the board that can draw you a card if an opponent doesn't want to get smacked by it. Epic Downfall is a situational Doomblade, but then again, Doomblade is also situational removal. However, unlike Doomblade and Terror, you're actually exiling the creature. The creature has to have a converted mana cost of 3 or greater, but this is Commander. Aren't the biggest threats in the format bigger than 3 CMC? Look at Blightsteel Colossus, Darksteel Colossus, Avacyn Angel of Hope, Ulamog the Infinite Gyre, and Ulamog the Ceaseless Hunger, just to name a few. Foreboding Fruit is a draw spell similar to Painful Lesson, Sign in Blood, etc., but gives you a food token as well if you spent 3 black mana to cast it. Not a bad card, especially in budget builds, since similar draw spells are great in budget builds to begin with. Foulmire Knight. Speaking of cheap draw spells, when you send Foulmire Knight on an adventure, you draw 1 less card and lose 1 less life for the same mana cost, but you can then get a 1/1 Death Touch Zombie Knight for just 1 black mana afterwards. Or, if you want to cast this turn 1 as a straight up creature, you can as well. Giant's Skewer is one of the few repeatable ways to get food tokens in this set. It also pumps a creeped creature +2/+1, but it costs 3 mana to equip. It costs 2 mana to cast, so it's not that bad a card. If its rarity were higher, maybe the equip cost would have been 2 or its buff would have been bigger. That being said, it's a common, so it'll definitely be easily acquirable for budget decks. Lash of Thorns is another 1 mana instant that can be used to kill an attacking creature. It pumps +2/+1, but as far as Death Touch is concerned, the pump in attack is irrelevant. The card would have been better with a straight up pump in Toughness like +0/+3, but making it better might have increased its rarity or casting cost. So, as it stands, it's just an effective and cheap way to make a blocker or rattlesnake and get rid of a huge threat. Malevolent Noble is quite literally an aristocrat since he's a noble. The title isn't lost on him though, since you can pay 2 mana and sacrifice another creature to give him a +1/+1 counter. Aristocrats prefer free sacrifice outlets, but this one is budget and at least it's legal in Brawl if you need to have an aristocrat type effect in that format. Murderous Rider, as its name implies, is straight up murder when it goes on an adventure. Not only does it murder creatures, but planeswalkers as well. It costs you 2 life to do so, but 2 life isn't that steep a cost to play, especially in EDH. Besides being murder personified, it's a 2/3 zombie knight with lifelink for 3 mana that bottom decks itself when it dies. This card is just crazy in not only zombie tribal decks, but knight tribal decks as well. Both tribes have tons of support, so this is definitely an amazing card to find a slot for in both decks. Oathsworn Knight is a card I burst out laughing after reading it, since every time it receives combat damage, you can shrug it off and exclaim, "'Tis just a scratch," or "It's just a flesh wound." It also reminds me of the Fallen Apart, so this is definitely a fun card to have. Notwithstanding, it can be quite powerful, since if you're able to consistently give it +1/+1 counters, it won't die from combat damage, similarly to cards like Phantom Nishoba. So there's also that. Order of Midnight is a 2/2 human knight with flying that can't block for just 2 mana. That might not seem so impactful, but you can pay 1 generic and 1 black to send it on an adventure, where it will return a creature card from your graveyard to your hand. So it does have some use. Its creature typing can also make it even more impacting in a human or knight tribal deck. Piper of the Swarm is crazy good in rat tribal, since you can pay 4, sacrifice 3 rats, and tap it to gain control of target creature. In Rat Colony and or Relentless Rats decks, the Piper fares amazingly well. Even more so if the commander is Ink Eye's Servant of Oni. Revenge of Ravens is an enchantment along the same vein as Hissing Miasma, and the like. If you like this kind of ability, then this can definitely find a home in your deck to increase the redundancy of those types of effects. Smitten Swordmaster is a crazy card in Knight Tribal deck, with an effect similar to Grey Merchant of Asphodel, except that X is the number of knights you control instead of your devotion to black. That being said, that ability only costs 1 black mana versus Gary's 5. It's then a 2/1 human knight with lifelink for just 2 mana, so it's still relevant in the Knight Tribal deck as a body that gets all pertinent boons. Spectre's Shriek is essentially a Thoughtseize with the drawback of maybe exiling a card from your hand instead of paying 2 life. I don't feel it's such a bad trade-off, especially since you can exile a land or other card you don't need at the moment in order to get rid of something worse from an opponent's hand. And If you just so happen to exile a black card, you don't need to exile anything from your own hand. Wishclaw Talisman is basically a scheming symmetry on an artifact that can be done thrice. Fortunately, there are ways around giving an opponent advantage from receiving it since they can only use it during their own turn. But this can also be used for politics, since you might use it to strike a temporary alliance with someone else at the table in order to deal with an opponent who's too far ahead. All in all, a very interesting card for multiplayer Commander. Also, if you use it to end the game, then it doesn't matter what an opponent gets if you tutor with it. Witch's Vengeance. Tribal decks and Weenie token decks are pretty commonplace in Commander. This spell allows you to get rid of those saplings, soldiers, zombies, goblins, elves, what have you. So if those kinds of decks are common in your meta, you might want to consider this card. Chittering Witch creates a 1/1 rat token for each opponent you have when it enters the battlefield. At 4 mana, it's not so bad. However, it has a non-free creature sacrifice outlet that gives target creature -2/-2 until end of turn without having to tap down the witch. This could be very useful in Stacks decks or Aristocrat decks. The ability might not be a free sacrifice outlet, but it isn't egregiously costed either. Taste of Death costs a whopping 6 mana to cast, but it makes each opponent sacrifice 3 creatures. You get 3 food tokens for your trouble. It's basically 3 Innocent Blood stapled together if Innocent Blood costs 1 more and gave you a food token for having to sacrifice your own creature. I wouldn't necessarily consider this a bad card though. In a dedicated deck, it's a good late game card if you had run out of steam or if players still manage to have a couple of creatures out regardless of your other stacks effects. Would I put this in my own Mazarek Prowl Death Priest or other stacks Commander? Probably not. How about if I were building on a budget? Then I probably would, if the card were cheap. Let's see what the set has in store for red. Barge In might not look like an impactful card in Commander, and you'd have been right a couple of years ago. But now we have cards like Zada, Hedron Grinder, and Feather the Redeemed. Targeting Zada with this will give all of your attacking creatures +2/+2, and if any of them are non-human, they get trample as well. If you target Feather with it, it'll return to your hand at the end of turn, so you can use it over and over again. Brimstone Trebuchet is a 1/3 wall for 3 mana that has a free tap to ping ability. If you like chalking your ping deck full of pingers, then this card's for you, especially since it pings each opponent for 1 instead of any single target. Burning Yard Trainer is a 3/3 with trample and haste for 5 mana. So it's not the best card for the 5 CMC slot in a Commander deck. However, in a heavy Knight Tribal deck, it gives another Knight you control +2/+2, haste, and trample until end of turn. Claim the Firstborn is a creature stealing spell that costs only 1 red mana. The trade-off for its casting cost is that you can only gain control of a creature with CMC 3 or less. Use it to steal a cheap Hate Bearer, Mana Dork, or other utility creatures. Embercleave essentially costs only 2 red, and it doesn't even have to be a very aggro deck since you only need to attack with 4 creatures to reduce the generic mana part of its casting cost. It has Flash, so you can cast it out of nowhere. It also equips for free when it enters the battlefield, giving equipped creature +1/+1, double strike, and trample. This can definitely take an opponent by surprise and potentially one-shot an unassuming player with commander damage. Embereth Shieldbreaker can destroy an artifact for just 1 red mana. You can then cast it afterwards from its adventure for just 2 mana, and it's a vanilla 2/2. That might not seem like much, but it can definitely be useful in a human tribal or Knight Tribal deck. Ferocity of the Wilds is cheaper yet situational Orcish Oriflamme that also grants trample to your non-human attackers. This can go in just about any aggro deck since it should no doubt be a budget card as well. Fervent Champion is a 1/1 human knight with first strike and haste for 1 red mana. It might not seem like much at first, especially since its other ability is that when it attacks, it gives another attacking knight you control +1/+0 until end of turn. However, that's just a bonus ability. Its equip ability is what's interesting. If you were to equip it with any equipment, that equip costs 3 generic mana less to equip. This means that you can equip any of the swords of X and Y to it for free, as well as other equipment such as Loxodon Warhammer, Whisper Silk Cloak, etc. Even though that ability can be given in spades to all knights in a Surgwyn Knight tribal deck, it's still a good creature for Equipment Matters decks. Fires of Invention is an odd card for red since it allows you to cheat the cost of spells so long as you have the same amount of lands in play as the spell's converted mana cost. It has the drawback of disallowing you to play more than 2 spells a turn, and it limits you to cast spells only during your turn. If the point is to keep your lands untapped and available to cast spells during other turns, you can't because of the first clause. However, I see this as a way to use your lands not for casting spells, but for paying for abilities. Maybe you just cast a huge fire-breathing dragon for free, like a Shivan dragon. Now you can use your available mana to activate its ability. Or maybe you can cast a spell for free and use your mana for its buyback or kicker cost. I can see this enchantment abused in decks with Venser the Sojourner, since you can use Venser to exile it until end of turn after you've cast your 2 spells for free. You can then continue casting things in your turn, and then the enchantment returns to play at the end of your turn. Ironcrag Feat is another red ritual that generates 3 net red mana. It has a drawback of letting you cast only 1 more spell afterwards. That means that any other spell you want to cast that turn would have to be in response to Ironcrag Feat. That being said, if you were to cast 1 more spell that turn, it might be a huge spell that you need just a bit more mana to pull off. So you can essentially cast a 7-costed spell in the relatively early game. Ironcrag Pyromancer is a 0/4 human wizard for 2 generic and 1 red that can burn any target for free each turn. The catch? You have to draw at least 2 cards each turn. This is in no way unachievable in a format where card advantage is of paramount importance. Having such a big butt means it's out of range of most burn spells, so there's that as well. Joust. Fighting is a mechanic predominant in green, but for just 2 mana you can have one of your creatures fight another, preferably choosing a knight as your fighter, since Joust gives it +2/+1 until end of turn. Mad Ratter is a 1/2 goblin creature for 3 generic and 1 red with a similar trigger to Ironcrag Pyromancer. When you draw your second card each turn, it triggers. It gives you 2 1/1 black rat creature tokens when you do. In a deck where drawing cards matters, you can easily create 2 1/1 rats each turn besides the fact that you're drawing 2 cards each turn. Rimrock Knight is a creature perfect for decks like Zadahedron Grinder. You can pump your creatures at instant speed for just 1 red mana, but you can then pay 2 mana to get a 3/1 also, which benefits the deck since it wants to have as many bodies as possible to pass around all the copies of spells Zada creates. Robber of the Rich is a 2/2 human archer rogue with reach and haste for just 2 mana. This Robin Hood has an effect similar to many cards like Stolen Strategy, but stuck on a creature. However, Robin Hood doesn't have the until end of turn clause. So, being so cheap to cast and having haste means that you can start exiling cards from the top of opponents' libraries early on and then cast them from exile at your convenience. Assuming you attack with the rogue, that turn you want to cast it though. Since Robin Hood is quite literally a legend, it's quite disappointing that Robber of the Rich wasn't a legendary creature itself. That would have been a really interesting mono-red commander. Oh well. 7 Dwarves is a 2/2 dwarf for 2 mana, and I love the flavor of this card. A deck can have at most 7 cards named 7 Dwarves, and then creatures named 7 Dwarves get +1/+1 for each other creature named 7 Dwarves that you control. Not only are these cards great in a dwarf tribal deck like Depala Pilot Exemplar, but also in decks where you're creating a ton of creature tokens that are copies of other creatures. Things can get out of hand very quickly. This is definitely a quirky and janky card, and this will no doubt be a card experimented on by those who love the jank, myself included. Sundering Stroke is a 7-costed sorcery that deals 7 damage divided between 1 to 3 targets. At first glance, it might not seem good, but if you spend 7 red mana on it, it can deal 7 damage to each of those 3 targets. So in a mono-red burn deck, the card suddenly doesn't become so bad. Thrill of Possibility is a strictly better Tormenting Voice since it's an instant. Rowan, Fearless Spark Mage, is one of the 5 Planeswalkers of the set, but technically only available in the Planeswalker deck, since you could also potentially crack her open in a collector booster also. She's a 5 loyalty Planeswalker for 5 mana, which isn't so bad. Her +1 ability is okay, since it can pump a creature and give them first strike. Vigilance would have been better in order to at least have that creature remain untapped to protect Rowan. Her -2 pings up to 2 creatures and prevents them from blocking next turn. Her ultimate is essentially an insurrection, but you need a couple of turns to get there if you're not proliferating her loyalty counters. As a Planeswalker deck Planeswalker, she's meant to be nerfed, but given the right deck, she can be somewhat decent. In a red heavy Super Friends deck, she could definitely find a home, especially since Chandra Acolyte of Flame gives all red Planeswalkers a loyalty counter. You can also turn her into a 4/4 flying dragon with Sarkhan the Masterless. Hell, since War of the Spark and Core Set 2020 rotate when Throne of Eldraine gets released, you can include Rowan in a Brawl deck helmed by either Chandra Acolyte of Flame or Sarkhan the Masterless if that's your cup of tea. Embereth Skyblazer is a 4/3 human knight that has flying during your turn for 4 mana, so its stats are decent for its mana cost. When it attacks, you can pay 3 mana to give all your creatures +X+0 until end of turn, where X is the number of opponents you have. This card might thus find a home in aggro decks, possibly Knight Tribal aggro, since I believe that's where this card is best suited. Okay, so now we've reached the final stretch of mono-colored cards, green. Steelbane Hydra is your typical 0/0 Hydra that enters the battlefield with X+1/+1 counters where X is in its casting cost. However, this Turtle Hydra does something with this counter besides just being big. You can pay 3 mana and remove a +1/+1 counter from it to destroy target artifact or enchantment. Incredibly useful in Hydra tribal decks or just any +1/+1 counters matters decks. With enough counters or ways to add counters, you can essentially determine which artifacts and or enchantments stay on the battlefield and which ones bite the dust. Thorn Mammoth is a 6/6 elephant with trample for 5 generic and 2 green, so it already has somewhat decent stats for a mono green creature. It has an enter the battlefield triggered ability that also triggers when another creature enters the battlefield under your control. What happens is that Thorn Mammoth fights up to 1 target creature you don't control. Being a 6/6 means that you can very easily get rid of creatures your opponents control, sometimes a couple at a time potentially. Edgewall Innkeeper. Now, I'm biased with the art of this card for obvious reasons. That being said, I'm a bit disappointed that with this set being the only one in the foreseeable future with adventure creatures, it would have been great to have a 5-colored legendary creature that cared about those adventure creatures, even if that was Kenrith. Unfortunately, adventure is only supported via a couple of cards, this one being one of them. Who knows, maybe in the next set, Return to Theros, we'll also have adventure creatures since we will be adventuring into the underworld of Theros. Or maybe in Return to Zendikar, we'll also have some more adventure creatures since that set is adventuring through an Eldrazi free Zendikar. Maybe that'll cool off Nahiri for a bit. Feasting Troll King is a 7/6 Troll Noble with Vigilance and Trample for 2 generic and 4 green, which can be useful and relevant in decks that care about Chroma and Devotion. If you cast it from your hand, it creates 3 food tokens when it enters the battlefield. You can also sacrifice 3 food tokens to return it to the battlefield from the graveyard. This is definitely a great beater with the potential of being very difficult to get rid of. Flaxen Intruder, if I recall correctly, was one of the first adventure creatures spoiled for this set, or at the very least to show off the new card frames for these types of creatures. Goldilocks is a 1/2 for 1 green mana that you can sacrifice after dealing combat damage to a player in order to destroy target artifact or enchantment that player controls. But let's be real. What people care most about this card is running it in their Ayula Queen Amongst Bears Bear Force 1 deck. For a whopping 7 mana, you can send Flaxen Intruder on an adventure, creating you 3 2/2 green bear creature tokens. Gilded Goose is a 0/2 bird with flying for just 1 green mana. When it enters the battlefield, you create a food token, but this is also another repetitive source of food tokens since you can also pay 2 and tap it to create 1. You can also tap it and sacrifice a food token to add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. So at least it's a one-time Birds of Paradise until you create more food tokens. The Great Henge is quite possibly already a commander staple without the set being even pre-released yet. In green decks, this card is very easy to cast since the generic cost is reduced by the greatest power among creatures you control. You can tap it to add double green to your mana pool and also gain 2 life. If that weren't enough, whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, you put a +1/+1 counter on it and draw a card. This card is just crazy in a deck like Chulane Teller of Tales or other decks that care about +1/+1 counters. But apart from the crazy synergy this card causes, there's really no reason not to run it in every deck that has the green color identity. Keeper of Fables is very similar to Oran Frostfang, and they're even costed exactly the same. For me, the snake is better than the cat, since the effect isn't restricted to non-human creatures, and it also gives attacking creatures you control Death Touch. That being said, adding Keeper of Fables does add some redundancy to that effect, and it also has a decent body at 4/5. It's also a cat if you care about that, for decks like Arabo, Roar of the World. Kenrith's transformation is an aura similar to the previously mentioned Frogify, where it removes the enchanted creature's abilities and makes its power toughness equal to 3/3. In Commander, that's not really that big a deal. It also replaces itself when it enters the battlefield, so that's a plus. Lovestruck Beast is a good turn 1 spell since it creates a 1/1 human creature token and can then be cast on its adventure for 3 mana. Being a 5/5 means that it has a solid body for that 3 CMC. The downside, unless you control a 1/1 creature, it can't attack. That's not even that big of a downside. You can very easily have this down on turn 1 or 2 and have it attacking by turn 3. And even if you can't attack with it, you can pretty much crew almost any vehicle since it has 5 power, so you don't even need it to use as an attack. Oakhame Adversary will probably see play in the sideboard of some decks in Standard, but it can still see the cost reduction in Commander since green is a popular color in Commander. It's a 2/3 elf warrior with Death Touch that can draw you a card whenever it deals combat damage. That's not a bad ability, and you can always keep it untapped to deter attacks since it has Death Touch. This card can see play in elf tribal decks or saboteur decks. Once and Future is an instant that works fine even if you don't cast it with Adamant. You can choose 2 cards from your graveyard for 4 mana, which isn't a bad trade. You put the first one in your hand and the second one on top of your library. If you do cast it with Adamant, both cards go to your hand. Once Upon a Time is essentially a free filtered draw spell you can cast on turn 0. This will definitely make some modern brewers try and find ways to abuse it. Even if you cast it normally in the game, it's still 2 mana at instant speed to look at the top 5 cards of your library to find a creature or a land to put into your hand. The rest of the cards are placed on the bottom of your library in a random order. Had the cards been milled away, this card would have probably been banned in Modern before the set was even released. Outmuscle. I just love this card because the art shows a knight just straight up suplexing a bear into the ground. That has to be one of the most brutal belly-to-back suplexes I've ever seen. Zangief would be proud. Return of the Wildspeaker is a great card draw spell since you can draw a bunch of cards at instant speed. At least that's the mode I'll probably be using the most. In a deck with tons of large creatures, you're essentially drawing way more cards than casting costs for this spell. It might seem like a lot at 5 mana, but in green decks this is easy to achieve. And it's also easy to cast in decks with other colors since it just has 1 green mana in its cost. This is definitely going in my Polukranos World Eater deck. Return to Nature is a strictly better naturalized since you also have the option of exiling a card from a graveyard. Wildborn Preserver is a 2/2 elf archer with flash and reach for 2 mana, which already gives it amazing stats. What makes it even better for the Commander format is that it can become incredibly huge. Whenever another non-human creature enters the battlefield under your control, you may pay X and then it gets X +1/+1 counters. That's crazy because it doesn't have to be a non-token creature to trigger it. X isn't limited to anything else either, so you can literally have a Llanowar Elves enter the battlefield and then pay 10 to put 10 +1/+1 counters on this creature. This creature can get huge fairly quickly in an Elf Tribal decks or Elf Ball decks. Wolf's Quarry is a token-making sorcery that creates 3 1/1 boar creatures for 6 mana. These little pigs create a food token when they die, which somehow justifies the casting cost. I think the casting cost is a tad high, but then again, it is a common rarity sorcery. I can see some uses for this card in Tokens Matters decks or even in a spell slinging deck. A deck like Wart the Raid Mother can make good use of spells like this one. Whew. Alright, we're almost done with this flight. Now only the multicolored cards and colorless cards remain. Dance of the Mass is an interesting spell in that it can be used to return artifacts and or non-aura enchantments from your graveyard to the battlefield. Unfortunately, you have to pay for the highest casting cost with X, and you can't choose X as 0 because then you'd be returning 0 artifacts with 0 CMC from the graveyard. However, if X is 6 or more, then they return to the battlefield animated. That would make these artifacts more susceptible to removal, but if you reanimate a bunch of eggs, then you can have a bunch of beaters in play afterwards. Definitely an interesting spell. Doom Foretold is a tame Braids Cabal minion on a white-black enchantment. When a player can't sacrifice something per its requirements, then you sacrifice it and they lose 2 life, you draw a card, gain 2 life, and create a 2/2 white knight creature with Vigilance. Since this triggers at the beginning of each player's upkeep, this definitely makes the rounds in a multiplayer EDH game. If your brew cares about sacrifice and is aristocratic, then this is the card for you. Drown in the Loch seems pretty busted in mill decks, and I'm pretty sure it'll see a lot of play in Modern. That might make its price go up, even if it's an uncommon. That being said, Commander games tend to have players have a significantly large graveyard that makes running this counterspell/removal spell significantly useful in control decks. Escape into the Wilds. Green already has a substantial amount of straight-up draw effects. Perhaps the color lacking in that department is red. Even if it lets you play another land that turn, why would I run this spell over something like Return of the Wild Speaker, which costs the same and is potentially better? I'm not really convinced by this spell. That being said, it can be used when you're unable to draw since it bypasses effects that don't let you draw cards since you're exiling instead of drawing. So it won't trigger opponents' Consecrated Sphinxes or Notion Thieves. Feyburrow Elder goes great in multicolor decks since it gets +1/+1 for each color among permanents you control. It can also potentially tap for 5 colors. This card is just straight up crazy. If you combine it with a card like Scrap Basket, it's a 5/5 that taps for Wooburg when Scrap Basket is all 5 colors. If you don't want to spend mana on Scrap Basket in order to make mana, you can also just create a 5-colored citizen creature token with plain wide Celebration and Protect It. I see Feyburrow Elder as a poor man's Bloom Tender, and that's okay since Bloom Tender is so incredibly expensive right now. Garruk Cursed Huntsman is finally back. This iteration of Garruk costs 6 mana but has 5 starting loyalty. He has no innate way to gain loyalty, but he does create 2/2 black and green wolf creature tokens that put a loyalty counter on each Garruk you control when they die. Although there aren't enough Garruk Planeswalkers to really go all in on a Garruk Tribal thanks to this card, you could potentially make a Garruk Cursed Huntsman's Oathbreaker deck that's Garruk Tribal. That way it's more consistent since it's a 60 card deck instead of a 100 card deck. Anyways, I'm going too off the tangent. Back on topic. His -3 ability straight up kills a creature and you draw a card. His ultimate is basically an overrun on an emblem, which isn't so bad. In a deck with a lot of stacks and token duplication, you can very easily get that emblem online. Improbable Alliance is an enchantment where, with enough draw engines, could get you a 1/1 blue flyer every turn besides the 2 cards you're drawing each turn. The only downside to this card is the incredibly overcosted loot effect. That's probably why this card is an uncommon and not a rare. Inspiring Veteran is a 2/2 human knight for just 2 mana, which are pretty decent stats. It's a Night Lord that pumps other knights you control by +1/+1. If you're really interested in a Knight Tribal deck where all creatures are knights and are changelings, then this is a card you can probably definitely add to it. Lochmere Serpent is a 7/7 serpent with flash for just 6 mana, so you could flash this in as a pretty epic blocker. Apart from that, you can pay 1 blue and sacrifice an island to make it unblockable until end of turn. you can also pay 1 black and sacrifice a swamp in order to gain a life and draw a card. On top of all that, you can pay blue and black to exile 5 cards from an opponent's graveyard and return Lockmere Serpent from your graveyard to your hand. It has to be done at sorcery speed, but it's still a great ability. Similarly to Robin Hood, the Loch Ness Monster is essentially a legendary creature, so I'm a bit disappointed in the fact that this creature isn't legendary. It's still a great card, but could have been even better for the format had it been legendary. Oko Thief of Crowns is the first planeswalker of his kind, and given his story, I had expected him to be black as well as blue and green, but unfortunately it seems like he won't be the first black, green, blue planeswalker. Anyways, he's a 3-costed planeswalker with a starting loyalty of 4, which is pretty decent. His +2 is one of the few ways to consistently obtain food tokens. His +1 changes an artifact into a 3/3 green elk creature token, so at least he can make a 3/3 every 2 turns while gaining loyalty. His ultimate isn't that unachievable since you can trade the food token created with an opponent's creature of power 3 or less. Oko is basically a planeswalker who combos with himself. His loyalty abilities need to be used alternatingly in order to gain the most of them though. Thus, he might not be used a great deal in Standard or Modern, which might make him cheap for us Commander players. At least when the Throne of Eldraine hype dies down. Outlaw's Merriment is a 4-costed enchantment representing Robin Hood's Merry Men. What I love most about this enchantment is that it gives me an excuse to use my 3-sided die. Yes, believe it or not, those things exist. The Royal Scions is the first double character planeswalker, something that has been done with legendary creatures before. It's a 3-costed planeswalker with 5 starting loyalty, which is amazing. Their first ability is a loot ability, and their second ability gives a creature +2/+0, first strike, and trample until end of turn. Their ultimate draws you 4 cards and then deals damage to any target equal to the number of cards in your hand. I see this planeswalker in many kinds of decks, from spellsling decks, to drawing decks, to wheeling decks, to Super Friends decks, to Madness decks. I don't think it's such an impacting planeswalker though, and it suffers from not having a way to protect itself, whether from creating a token or getting rid of a creature. But it does have a high starting loyalty with a low casting cost to make up for that. Savvy Hunter is a 3/3 human warrior for 3 mana that creates a food token whenever it attacks or blocks. That isn't necessarily the most efficient way to make food tokens. However, if you sacrifice 2 food tokens to its second ability, you draw a card. Stormfist Crusader is a 2/2 human knight with menace that costs 2 mana. So far so good. It also has a slow bomb ability where at the beginning of your upkeep, each player draws a card and loses 1 life. This essentially makes Stormfist Crusader a Phyrexian arena for the whole table. Wandermare is a 3/3 horse for 3 mana that gets a +1/+1 counter on it for each creature spell you cast that has an adventure. Again, there are a couple of cards in the set that synergize with the new adventure mechanic, but it would have been great to have had this on a legendary creature so that it could always be available in the command zone. Wintermoor Commander is a 2-star human knight with Death Touch for 2 mana, whose toughness is equal to the number of knights you control. Whenever it attacks, it gives indestructible to another knight you control. I think this card is great for Knight Tribal, especially since it's a cheap knight to cast. Oko the Trickster is the second planeswalker from the planeswalker decks. He costs 6 mana for a starting loyalty of 4, which isn't that good unfortunately. Its +1 puts 2 +1/+1 counters on a creature you control, which isn't bad if it costed just a bit less. Its second ability changes Oko into a copy of a creature you control. On top of that, any damage he receives is prevented. This is an amazing ability though, since you can change Oko into a copy of one of your best creatures for some epic hijinxes. His ultimate isn't that difficult to achieve, and it isn't that bad considering it's from a starter product. All of your creatures become 10/10s until end of turn with trample. It is a potentially game-ending ultimate at least. Oko's Hospitality isn't a bad spell for coming out of a starter product. For 5 mana, creatures you control become 3/3 until end of turn. It essentially costs the same and does the same as Biomass Mutation with X = 3, only without the option of changing the base power toughness for its casting cost. That being said, it does have the added bonus of tutoring specifically for Oko the Trickster from out of your library and or graveyard. Banish into Fable is an instant that costs 6 with the potential of returning up to 3 non-land permanents to their owner's hand while also creating for you a 3/3 white knight creature token with Vigilance. Although the spell might seem overcosted in having to keep 6 mana open, it is a splashy spell, which is what Commander is all about. Gluttonous Troll is a 3/3 troll with trample that costs 4 mana. When it enters the battlefield, it creates a food token equal to the number of opponents you have. Although not a free sacrifice outlet, it can give itself +2/+2 until end of turn for 2 mana and sacrificing another non-land permanent. Knight's Charge is an amazing and cheaply costed enchantment that's amazing in a Knight tribal deck. Whenever a Knight you control attacks, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. You can also pay 8 mana and sacrifice it to return all Knights from your graveyard to the battlefield. That might seem like a steep cost, but after plenty of combats and board wipes, you'll no doubt have a graveyard full of Knights. Covetous Urge is a sorcery similar in function to Robin Hood in that you can exile a non-land card from a player's graveyard or hand in order to spend mana as though it were any color to cast that spell. For 4 mana, it's not such a bad spell. At the very least, you're depriving your opponents of one of their cards. There's an almost mega cycle, because it'd be missing the blue-black color combination of creatures that each cost 4 hybrid mana to cast. Honestly, I feel like these creatures best serve to make it easier to make Theros gods complete their devotion. With just one of these creatures in play, any monocolored god will achieve their devotion, and any 2-colored god will achieve devotion with any creature that has its same color combination. Okay, now let's see those colorless spells that can go inside any deck. Crashing Drawbridge is a 0/4 wall with Defender that costs 2 mana that taps to give haste to all of your creatures. This creature can go in any deck, which is what makes it so great. Enchanted Carriage is a 4/4 vehicle that creates 2 white 1/1 mouse creature tokens when it enters the battlefield. These can be used to crew it since its crew cost is just 2. Gingerbrute. I love this card. I love its art and its casting cost. A 1/1 for 1 with haste is just an all-round great weenie. For 1 mana, it can't be blocked by a creature unless it has haste. It being a food means you can pay 2 and tap it to sacrifice to gain 3 life. That's not the main reason I'd run it though. It's a card I would run in my Edric Spymaster of Trest unblockable weenies deck since it's so easy to cast, and when you need to make it unblockable, you just pay 1. Golden Egg is almost like the archetypical egg, but this one draws you the card when it enters the battlefield. You can pay 1 and tap it to add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool like a typical egg does. You can also pay 2 and tap to sacrifice it to gain 3 life. Heraldic Banner is a card the Commander community rejoiced upon its reveal. It's a mana rock for 3, which isn't that good, but it isn't bad either. It also pumps your creatures of that chosen color by +1/+0, so it's 2 effects rolled into a single card that can be played in any Commander deck. Jousting Dummy and Signpost Scarecrow aren't really all that good outside of more Scarecrows to run in a Reaper King Scarecrow tribal deck. At least Reaper King makes these awful cards into Vindicates. Lucky Clover is a great artifact that lets you copy adventure spells for free. Again, the lack of a 5-colored legendary creature that cared about casting adventures is bumming me out. This 2-costed artifact would be crazy in a 5-colored adventure deck. Shambling Suit is a star 3 construct for 3 mana whose power is equal to the number of artifacts and or enchantments you control. It's along the same vein as Beasts of Burden, but it costs half as much, can also be pumped by the amount of enchantments you control as well, even though its toughness doesn't change from 3. Sorcerer's Broom is an interesting and janky card that can be abused in the right deck. Although it costs 2 to cast and 3 to copy, it could potentially be used to trigger abilities that care about creatures and or artifacts entering the battlefield. Since it'll probably go in a Stacks or Aristocrats deck anyways, you could also use those copies as sacrifice fodder. At the very least, it has 1 toughness, so its copies can be used for Skull Clamp. Stonecoil Serpent is an amazing card on its own, but when I saw it, the first thing that came to mind was Rayami First of the Fallen. You can cast it for free, and thus it enters the battlefield without any +1/+1 counters on it. It dies as a state-based action, but with Rayami in play, it's exiled instead with a blood counter on it, permanently giving Rayami reach, trample, and protection from Multicolor. You can see more about Rayami in my deck tech video in the link above. Witch's Oven is a super cheap and interesting sacrifice outlet. It only costs 1, and its tap ability is free. You sacrifice a creature to create a food token, but you can create 2 instead if the creature's toughness is 4 or greater. So the bigger the booty, the bigger the pie. Arcane Signet is obviously going in pretty much every commander deck out there. I've already been taking it into consideration for all my deck techs ever since it was spoiled in late July. Tome of Legends only costs 2 to cast, which is great. It enters the battlefield with a page counter on it. It also gains a page counter when your commander enters the battlefield or attacks. This pairs incredibly well with partner commanders. And why do we care about page counters? For 1 and tapping, we remove a page counter in order to draw a card. This is essentially a very cheap and consistent way to draw cards in the commander format. Alright, ladies and gentlemen, we've reached the final sampling of this flight, the lands. I'm honestly incredibly surprised that the castle cycle weren't legendary lands. I feel like flavor-wise they should have been legendary, and maybe that could have justified them being better than how they are now. They could have also had a castle type like Gates and Lairs. But what really bugs me about them is that their abilities are too overcosted for what they do. They could have been legendary to justify their ability having a lower cost, especially since they're essentially just single-colored check lands with an overcosted ability. What I do like is the cycle of common, basic typed lands. They're fetchable, and in decks with plenty of lands of those types, their abilities become very useful at instant speed if you fetch them at an appropriate time. The one I like most is Dwarven Mine, since it's a mountain that can give me a 1/1 dwarf creature token. This is definitely going in my Zadahedron grinder deck. Mystic Sanctuary is already part of an infinite combo with Meloku the Clouded Mirror and any extra turn spell that doesn't exile itself. After you cast the extra turn spell, bounce Mystic Sanctuary with Meloku's ability. Then you return it to your hand to put the extra turn spell on top of your library. On your extra turn, you draw into the extra turn spell. You cast it again, then play Mystic Sanctuary to once more top deck the extra turn spell. Then you activate Meloku to return the Sanctuary to your hand. You can do this infinitely many times to create infinite 1/1 blue flying illusion tokens to win the game via infinite combat damage. Fabled Passage should have been uncommon, since it's strictly worse than Prismatic Vista, which is already rare. The life lost is a way better trade-off than conditional untap. I still appreciate Wizards trying to replicate the power of fetch lands in Standard, but Fabled Passage is only slightly better than Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanse, so it should have taken up an uncommon slot instead of a rare slot. Tournament Grounds is a great tribal land. It's a shame that Wizards continues to have such large gaps between completing land cycles, especially for formats like Commander. I'm still waiting for Wedge Lairs. They really dropped the ball on that one for the first Commander precons, especially since it contained the plane-shifted versions of Daragaz and company. But I digress. And the final card I'm going to discuss is Command Tower. Who would have thought Command Tower would ever be legal in Standard? At least this reprint has a different art in case you were getting tired of the same art used year after year for Command Tower. Thus concludes this flight of cards from Throne of Eldraine. Overall, I really love this set and can't wait until it's released to add some choice cards to my Commander decks. I hope this episode has been informative for you, even though these are clearly my own opinions and views on the cards herein discussed. If you have any opinions or thoughts of your own on these cards, or if I overlooked any other hidden gems for Commander, let me know in the comments. I want to take this opportunity to thank my patrons by giving a shout out to all my higher tier patrons, the Brewers, for their patronage. I also want to thank all of those who've liked, shared, commented, and subscribed so far to my channel. My continued growth is thanks to your support. And to everyone, thanks for watching this lengthy episode of a flight on the Commander Tavern. I am Demented Kirby, and happy theory crafting.